Okay, let me get myself to Twitch on my phone. Hello. How are you? Oh, wow. Good catch. Did you find it from, were you just here, or was it, what's it called? One of the things on either Twitter or Facebook that told you? I'm doing headache, sinus headache. Just kind of a lot right now. Oh. Well, thank you for popping in so early. I think, let's see if we've got other people coming in. Oh, hello. Thank you. How are you doing? Thank you. I'm like the Witch of the Waste, but the good witch, not the Witch of the Waste. What was her name? Mrs. Penstemon? Her. But, like, maybe not as old as her. Witch of the Cute. Thank you. So, yeah, surprise, we're back. I know it's been a little while, but streaming just didn't work out while I had someone staying over on vacation, and then I really wanted to, like, jump back in to try doing Pokemon again, but it just, I kind of needed to rest yesterday. Yeah, Nageki is here too. Yeah, so, yeah, back now, and I'd like to try doing Pokemon again at some point, or something. I'd like to do another game, stream. If not Pokemon, maybe something else. Like, I would love to still do that Nuzlocke, but I don't know if it's gonna work out with the emulator that I have, or just on my computer. I'd also be happy to do, like, another visual novel. Just a matter of, like, what would be good in that category. But more things to think about later. Right now, we have Howl's Moving Castle that we can jump back into. I'm excited. It's been a while, and we were, like, quite close to the end. You can see. Or close-ish. So I'm excited to see, like, just where we go from where we were. I think that where we just left off, okay, yeah, Hal got back after fighting the Witch of the Waste. They were talking about the idea of, oh, I remember that they moved the castle. They used, they have, like, 2 different openings now, I think, or 3 different openings. Basically to, try and, not outrun, but evade the witch. They opened one in Market Chipping, which was in the old hat shop. And then, where's the other one again? Yeah, they moved to Sophie's shop. That's one of them. And then there was the other one that was by the field, right? Like the flower field, and that's where... Well, no, there is Wales. Yes, there's Wales. But there's also one that's like by a flower field, I believe, and that's where they're getting all the supplies to make the hats that they're making in the hat shop. And so I came to the witch. She objected to it. Ah, yeah, Wizard Suleiman. I think this notion was to make the waste flower and abolish the witch that way. He brought hot springs to the surface and got it growing. He was doing very nice. Oh, right. That's where the field is. The field is like just outside of the waste. And yeah, he came from the same place as you. Mrs. Princeton said some other name. He came from the same place as you, didn't he? More or less. I've never met him though. I'm pretty sure that was... Suleiman was actually the one who Mrs. Arjanon was like with, or whatever, who'd gone missing in Wales. I think. Yeah. I tried to do the things you'd least expect. And are you trying to find Prince Justin? Sophie asked, but Hal slithered out of answering by racing through the broom cupboard, shouting for Michael. So I guess that's pretty much where we were. Let me see and try to parse ahead, like, where we would end up stopping. Hold on. Hypothetically. Oh, it's very close to the end. Wow. Ho ho. Ho ho. I think that if we end where we're supposed to end this time, it'll be like one chapter before the end of the book. Let me see. Hold on. Wow, this final chapter is quite, not final chapter, but the chapter before that final chapter is quite long. Yeah, there's no way around it. Well, let's see how we do. Maybe we'll finish the book today. I don't know. Let me put this in there. And I'm just gonna take a drink of water before we start. Hold on. It's important to stay hydrated, and it's also very warm under this light, so even if you're not under this light, stay hydrated and drink some water. Okay. Sorry, I have like a lot of tension today. There's a lot in my hands and everything. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. Chapter 18, in which the Scarecrow and Miss Angorian, that was the name, not Arjanon, Angorian appear, in which the Scarecrow and Miss Angorian reappear. Good, I'm glad you have water. They opened the flower shop the next day. As Hal had pointed out, it could not have been simpler. Every early morning, all they had to do was to open the door with the knob purple down to go out into the swimming green haze to gather flowers. It soon became a routine. Sophie took her stick and her scissors and stumped about, chatting to her stick, using it to test the squashy ground or hook down sprays of high-up choice roses. Michael took an invention of his own, which he was very proud of. It was a large tin tub with water in it, which floated in the air and followed Michael wherever he went among the bushes. The dogman... Oh, right! I forgot about the dogman! The dogman went too. He had a wonderful time rushing about the wet green lanes, chasing butterflies or trying to catch the tiny bright birds that fed on the flowers. While he dashed about, Sophie cut armloads of long irises or lilies or fondly orange flowers or branches of blue hibiscus, and Michael loaded the bath with orchids, roses, starry white flowers, shiny vermilion ones, or anything that caught his fancy. They all enjoyed this time. Then, before the heat in the bushes grew too intense, they took the day's flowers back to the shop and arranged them in a motley collection of jugs and buckets which Hal had dug out of the yard. 2 of the buckets were actually the 7-league boots. Nothing, Sophie thought, as she arranged shocks of gladiolus in them, could show how completely Hal had lost interest in Letty. He did not care now if Sophie used them or not. Hal was nearly always missing while they gathered flowers, and the doorknob was always turned black down. He was usually back for a late breakfast, looking dreamy, still in his black clothes. He would never tell Sophie which suit the black one really was. "I'm in mourning for Mrs. Penstemon," was all he would say. And if Sophie or Michael asked why Hal was always away at that time, Hal would look injured and say, "If you want to talk to a school teacher, you have to catch her before school starts." Then he would disappear into the bathroom for the next 2 hours. He's after Mrs. Angorian. I have to turn back and check. For some reason that name is just not sticking in my memory. Meanwhile, Sophie and Michael put on their fine clothes and opened the shop. Hal insisted on the fine clothes. He said it would attract custom. Sophie insisted they all wore aprons. And after the first few days, when the people of market shipping simply stared through the window and did not come into the shop became very popular. Word had gone round that Jenkins had flowers like no flowers ever seen before. People Sophie had known all her life came and bought flowers by the bundle. None of them recognized her, and that made her feel very odd. They all thought she was Hal's old mother. But Sophie had had enough of being Hal's old mother. "I'm his aunt," she told Mrs. Cesari. She became known as Aunt Jenkins. That's really funny. Just like anything but his old mother. By the time Hal arrived in the shop in a black apron to match his suit, he usually found it quite busy. He made it busier still. This was when Sophie began to be sure that the black suit was really the charmed gray and scarlet one. Any lady Hal served was sure to go away with at least twice the number of flowers she asked for. Most of the time, Hal charmed them into buying 10 times as much. Before long, Sophie noticed ladies peering in and deciding not to come into the shop when they saw Hal there. She did not blame them. If you just want a rose for a buttonhole, you do not want to be forced to buy 3 dozen orchids. She did not discourage Hal when Hal took to spending long hours in the workshed across the yard. "I'm setting up defenses against the witch, before you ask," he said. "By the time I finish, there will be no way she can get into any part of this place." There was sometimes a problem with leftover flowers. Sophie could not bear to see them wilting overnight. She found she could keep them fairly fresh if she talked to them. After that, she talked to flowers a lot. She got Michael to make her a plant nutrition spell, and she experimented in buckets in the sink, and in tubs in the alcove where she used to trim hats. She found she could keep some plants fresh for days. So of course she experimented some more. She got the soot out of the yard and planted things in it, muttering busily. She grew a navy blue rose like that, which pleased her greatly. Its buds were coal black, and its flowers opened bluer and bluer until they became almost the same blue as calcifer. Sophie was so delighted with it that she took roots from all of the bags hanging on the beams and experimented with those. She told herself she had never been happier in her life. That was not true. Something was wrong, and Sophie could not understand what. Sometimes she thought it was the way no one in market shipping recognized her. She did not dare go and see Martha, for fear Martha would not know her either. She did not dare tip the flowers out of the 7-league boots and go and see Letty for the same reason. She just could not bear either of her sisters to see her as an old woman. Michael went off with bunches of spare flowers to see Martha all the time. Sometimes Sophie thought that was what was the matter with her. Michael was so cheerful, and she was left on her own in the shop more and more often. But that did not seem to be quite it. Sophie enjoyed selling flowers on her own. Sometimes the trouble seemed to be Calcifer. Calcifer was bored. He had nothing to do except to keep the castle gently drifting along the lanes of grass and round the various pools and lakes, and to make sure that they arrived in a new spot with new flowers every morning. His blue face was always leaning eagerly out of the grate when Sophie and Michael came in with their flowers. "I want to see what it's like out there," he said. Sophie brought him tasty-smelling leaves to burn, which made the castle room smell as strongly as the bathroom, but Calcifer said what he really wanted was company. They went into the shop all day and left him alone. So Sophie made Michael serve in the shop for at least an hour every morning while she went and talked to Calcifer. She invented guessing games to keep Calcifer occupied when she was busy, but Calcifer was still discontented. "When are you going to break my contract with Howl?" he asked, more and more often. And Sophie put Calcifer off. "I'm working on it," she said. "It won't be long now." This was not quite true. Sophie had stopped thinking of it unless she had to. When she put together what Mrs. Penstemon had said with all the things Howl and Calcifer had said, she found she had some strong and rather terrible ideas about that contract. She was sure that breaking it would be the end of both Howl and Calcifer. Howl might deserve it, but Calcifer did not. And since Howl seemed to be working quite hard in order to slither out of the rest of the witch's curse, Sophie wanted to do nothing unless she could help. Sometimes Sophie thought that it was simply that the dogman was getting her down. He was such a doleful creature. The only time he seemed to enjoy himself was when he chased down the green lanes between the bushes every morning. For the rest of the day, he trudged gloomily about after Sophie, sighing deeply. As Sophie could do nothing about him either, she was rather glad when the weather grew hotter and hotter toward Midsummer Day, and the dogman took to lying in patches of shade out in the yard, panting. Meanwhile, the roots Sophie had planted had become quite interesting. The onion had become a small palm tree and was sprouting little onion-scented nuts. Another root grew into a sort of pink sunflower. Only one was slow to grow. When at last it put out 2 round green leaves, Sophie could hardly wait to see what it would grow into. The next day, it looked as if it might be an orchid. It had pointed leaves spotted with mauve, and a long stalk growing out of the middle with a large bud on it. The day after that, Sophie left the fresh flowers in the tin bath and hurried eagerly to the alcove to see how it was getting on. The bud had opened into a pink flower like an orchid that had been through a mangle. It was flat and joined to the stalk just below a round tip. There were 4 petals sprouting from a plump and pink middle, 2 pointing downward and 2 more halfway up that stuck out sideways. While Sophie stared at it, a strong scent of spring flowers warned her that Howl had come in and was standing behind her. "What is that thing?" he said. "If you were expecting an ultraviolet violet or an infrared geranium, you got it wrong, Mrs. Mad Scientist. It looks to me like a squashed baby flower. Oh, sorry. It looks to me like a squashed baby flower," Michael said, coming to look. It did, too. Hal shot Michael an alarmed look and picked up the flower in its pot. He slid it out of the pot and into his hand, where he carefully separated the white, thready roots and the soot and the remains of the manure spell until he uncovered the brown, forked root Sophie had grown it from. "I might have guessed," he said. "It's a mandrake root." "Sophie strikes again. You do have a touch, don't you, Sophie?" He put the plant carefully back, passed it to Sophie, and went away, looking rather pale. So, that was almost all the curse come true, Sophie thought as she went to arrange the fresh flowers in the shop window. The mandrake root had a baby. "Oh, wow. I forgot about that part of the curse. And that's why oh my god, he's like, I can't stand you. You are actually physically killing me." Because the curse was that, like, when the mandrake root, like, has a baby or whatever, like, he's, like, one step closer to death, I think, or being defeated by the witch. And so Sophie accidentally actually made that happen. The mandrake root had a baby. That only left one more thing, the wind to advance an honest mind. If that meant Hal's mind had to be honest, Sophie thought, there was a chance that the curse might never come true. She told herself it served Hal right anyway for going courting Miss Angorian every morning in a charmed suit, but she still felt alarmed and guilty. She arranged a sheaf of white lilies in a 7-league boot. She crawled into the window to get them just so, and she heard a regular clump, clump, clump from outside in the street. It was not the sound of a horse. It was the sound of a stick hitting the stones. Sophie's heart was behaving oddly even before she dared to look out the window. There, sure enough, came the Scarecrow, hopping slowly and purposefully down the center of the street. The rags trailing from its outstretched arms were fewer and grayer, and the turnip on its face was withered into a look of determination, as if it had hopped ever since Howl hurled it away, until at last it had hopped its way back. Sophie was not the only one to be scared. The few people about that early were running away from the Scarecrow as hard as they could run. But the Scarecrow took no notice and hopped on. Sophie hid her face from it. "We're not here," she told it in a fierce whisper. "You don't know we're here. You can't find us. Hop away fast." The clump of the hopping sticks slowed as the Scarecrow neared the shop. Sophie wanted to scream for Howl, but all she seemed to be able to do was go on repeating, "We're not here. Go away quickly." And the hopping speeded up, just as she told it to, and the Scarecrow hopped its way past the shop and on through market shipping. Sophie thought she was going to come over queer, but she seemed just to have been holding her breath. She took a deep breath and felt shaky with relief. If the Scarecrow came back, she could send it away again. Howl had gone out when Sophie went into the castle room. "He seemed awfully upset," Michael said. Sophie looked at the door. The knob was blacked down. "Not that upset," she thought. Michael went out too to Cesari's that morning, and Sophie was alone in the shop. It was very hot. The flowers wilted in spite of the spells, and very few people wanted to buy any. What with this, and the mandrake root, and the Scarecrow, all Sophie's feelings seemed to come to a head. She was downright miserable. It may be the curse hovering to catch up with Howl, she sighed to the flowers, but I think it's being the eldest, really. Look at me. I set out to seek my fortune, and I end up exactly where I started, and old as the hills still. Here the dogman put his glossy round snout round to the door, and Here the dogman put his glossy round snout round to the door, to the yard, and whined. Sophie sighed. Never an hour passed without the creature checking up on her. "Yes, I'm still here," she said. "Where did you expect me to be?" The dog came inside the shop. He sat up and stretched his paws out stiffly in front of him. Sophie realized he was trying to turn into a man. Poor creature. She tried to be nice to him because he was, after all, worse off than she was. "Try harder," she said. "Put your back into it. You can be a man if you want." The dog stretched and straightened his back and strained, and just as Sophie was sure he was going to have to give up or topple over backward, he managed to rise to his hind legs and heave himself up into a distraught, ginger-haired man. "I envy Howl," he panted. "Does that so easily. I was dog in the hedge. You helped. Told Eddie. I knew I'd keep watch. I was here before he began to double up again into a dog and howled with annoyance. 'With witch in shop!' he wailed, and fell forward onto his hands, growing a great deal of gray and white hair as he did so. Sophie stared at the large, shaggy dog that now stood there. "You were with the witch," she said. She remembered now. Oh, that was the guy who accompanied the witch to her hat shop. Yeah, he did it. Good boy. What's it called? Yeah, so he was the one who was with her, not with her, who was with the Witch of the Waste, when the witch cursed Sophie to begin with. There was like a guy that had come with her. She remembered now, the anxious, ginger-haired man who had stared at her in horror. "Then you know who I am, and you know I'm under a spell. Does Letty know too?" The huge, shaggy head nodded. "And she called you Gaston," Sophie remembered. "Oh, my friend, she has made it hard for you. Fancy having all that hair in this weather. You'd better go somewhere cool." The dog nodded again and shambled miserably into the yard. "Oh, so Letty knows." But why did Letty send you? Sophie wondered. She felt thoroughly put out and disturbed by this discovery. She went up the stairs and through the broom cupboard to talk to Calcifer. Calcifer was not much help. "It doesn't make any difference how many people know that you're under a spell," he said. "It hasn't helped that dog much, has it?" "No, but," Sophie began, but just then the castle door clicked and opened. Sophie and Calcifer looked. They saw the doorknob was still set to black down, and they expected Hal to come through it. It was hard to say which of them was more astonished when the person who slid rather cautiously round the door turned out to be Miss Angorian. Miss Angorian was equally astonished. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said. "I thought Mr. Jenkins might be here." "He's out," Sophie said stiffly, and she wondered where Hal had gone, if not to see Miss Angorian. Miss Angorian let go of the door, which she had been clutching in her surprise. She left it swinging open on nothing and came pleadingly towards Sophie. Sophie found she had got up herself and can't come across the room. It seemed as if she was trying to block Miss Angorian off. "Please," said Miss Angorian, "don't tell Mr. Jenkins I was here. To tell you the truth, I only encouraged him in hope of getting news of my fiancé, Ben Sullivan, you know. I'm positive Ben disappeared to the same place Mr. Jenkins keeps disappearing to. Only Ben didn't come back." There's no Mr. Sullivan here," Sophie said. And she thought, "That's Wizard Suleiman's name. I don't believe a word of it." "Oh, I know that," said Miss Angorian said, "but this feels like the right place. Do you mind if I just look round a little to give myself some idea of the sort of life Ben's leading now?" She hooked her sheet of black hair around one ear and tried to walk further into the room. Sophie stood in the way. This forced Miss Angorian to tiptoe pleadingly away sideways towards the workbench. "How very quaint," she said, looking at the bottles and the jars. "What a quaint little town," she said, looking out of the window. "It's called Market Chipping," Sophie said, and she moved round and herded Miss Angorian back toward the door. "And what's up those..." She's taking this all very well. "And what's up those stairs?" Miss Angorian asked, pointing to the door, to the open door to the stairs. "Hal's private room," Sophie said firmly, walking Miss Angorian away backward. "And what's through the other open door?" Miss Angorian asked. "A flower shop," said Sophie. "Nosy Parker," she thought. By this time, Miss Angorian either had to go back into the chair or out through the door again. Ooh, I forgot to shut down my mail app. Not that you'll get the notification of what's going on. I don't care, it's just annoying to be on the screen. But also, we don't want that boom noise every time either, so... Blah, blah, blah. Where were we? Yes, okay. By this time, Miss Angorian either had to go back into the chair or out through the door again. She stared at Calcifer in a vague, frowning way, as if she was not sure what she was seeing, and Calcifer simply stared back without saying a word. This made Sophie feel better about being so very unfriendly. Only people who understood Calcifer were really welcome in Hal's home. But now Miss Angorian made a dive round the chair and noticed Hal's guitar leaning in its corner. She snatched it up with a gasp and turned around, holding it to her chest possessively. "Where did you get this?" she demanded in a low, emotional voice. "Ben had a guitar like this. It could be Ben's." "I heard Hal bought it last winter," Sophie said, and she walked forward again, trying to scoop Miss Angorian out of her corner and through the door. "Something's happened to Ben," Miss Angorian said throbbingly. "He would never have parted from his guitar. Where is he? I know he can't be dead. I know in my heart if he were." Sophie wondered whether to tell Miss Angorian that the witch had caught Wizard Suleiman. She looked across to see where the human skull was. She had half a mind to wave it in Miss Angorian's face and say that it was Wizard Suleiman's. But the skull was in the sink, hidden behind a bucket of spare ferns and lilies, and she knew that if she went over there, Miss Angorian would ooze out into the room again. Besides, it would be unkind. "May I take this guitar?" Miss Angorian said huskily, clutching it to her. "To remind me of Ben." The throb in Miss Angorian's voice annoyed Sophie. "No," she said. "There's no need to be so intense about it. You've no proof it was his." She hobbled closer to Miss Angorian and seized the guitar by its neck. Miss Angorian stared at her over it with wide, anguished eyes. Sophie dragged. Miss Angorian hung on. The guitar gave out horrible, out-of-tune jangles. Sophie jerked it out of Miss Angorian's arms. "Don't be silly," she said. "You have no right to walk into people's castles and take their guitars. I've told you Mr. Sullivan's not here. Now go back to Wales. Go on." And she used the guitar to push Miss Angorian backward through the open door. Miss Angorian backed into the nothingness until half of her vanished. "You're hard," she said reproachfully. "Yes, I am," said Sophie, and slammed the door on her. She turned the knob to orange down to prevent Miss Angorian coming back and dumped the guitar back in its corner with a firm twang. "And don't you dare tell Hal she was here," she said unreasonably to Calcifer. "I bet she came to see Hal. The rest was just a pack of lies. Wizard Suleiman was settled here years ago. He probably came to get away from her beastly throbbing voice." Calcifer chuckled. "I've never seen anyone get rid of her I've never seen anyone got rid of so fast," he said. "Yeah, besides, it would be unkind." I like that too. Like, that was a secondary reason. This made Sophie feel both unkind and guilty. After all, she herself had walked into the castle in much the same way, and she had been twice as nosy as Miss Angorian. Gah! She said. She stumped into the bathroom and stared at her withered old face in the mirrors. She picked up one of the packets labeled Skin, and then tossed it down again. Even young and fresh, she did not think her face compared particularly well with Miss Angorian's. Gah! She said. Doof! She hobbled rapidly back and seized ferns and lilies from the sink. She hobbled them, dripping, to the shop, where she rammed them into a bucket of nutrition spell. Be daffodils, she told them in a mad, angry, croaking voice. Be daffodils in June, you beastly things! The dogman put his shaggy face round the yard door. When he saw the mood Sophie was in, he backed out again hurriedly. When Michael came merrily in with a large pie a minute later, Sophie gave him such a glare that Michael instantly remembered a spell Hal had asked him to make up and fled away through the broom cupboard. Gah! Sophie snarled after him. She bent over her bucket again. Be daffodils! Be daffodils! She croaked. It did not make her feel any better that she knew it was a silly way to behave. Chapter 19, in which Sophie expresses her feelings with Weed Killer. Oh. What? Hal opened the shop door toward the end of the afternoon and sauntered in, whistling. He seemed to have got over the mandrake root. It did not make Sophie feel any better to find that he had not gone to Wales after all. She gave him her very fiercest glare. Merciful heavens, Hal said. I think that turned me to stone. What's the matter? Sophie only snarled. What suit are you wearing? Hal looked down at his black garments. Does it matter? Yes, growled Sophie. And don't give me that about being in mourning. Which one is it really? Hal shrugged and held up one of the trailing sleeves as if he were not sure which it was. He stared at it, looking puzzled. The black color of it ran downward from his shoulder to the pointed, hanging tip. His shoulder and the top of his sleeve grew brown, then gray, while the pointed tip turned inkier and inkier until Hal was wearing a black suit with one blue and silver sleeve, whose end seemed to have been dipped in tar. That one, he said, and let the black spread back up to his shoulder again. Sophie was somehow more annoyed than ever. She gave a wordless grump of rage. Sophie, Hal said in his most laughing, pleading way. The dogman pushed open the yard door and shambled in. He never would let Hal talk to Sophie for long. Hal stared at it. You've got an old English sheepdog now, he said as if he was glad of the distraction. 2 dogs are going to take a lot of feeding. There's only 1 dog, Sophie said crossly. He's under a spell. He is, said Hal, and he set off toward the dog with a speed that showed he was quite glad to get away from Sophie. This, of course, was the last thing the dogman wanted. He backed away. Hal pounced and caught him by 2 handfuls of shaggy hair before he could reach the door. So he is, he said, and knelt down to look into what could be seen of the sheepdog's eyes. Sophie, he said, what do you mean by not telling me about this? This dog is a man, and he's in a terrible state. Hal, you didn't know? How did he not know? Hal whirled round on one knee, still holding the dog. Sophie looked into Hal's glass marble glare and realized that Hal was angry now. Really angry. Good! Sophie felt like a fight. You could have noticed for yourself, she said, glaring back, daring Hal to do his worst with green slime. Anyway, the dog didn't want. Hal was too angry to listen. He jumped up and hauled the dog across the tiles, and so I would have done if I hadn't had things on. Sorry, gonna read that again. And so I would have done if I hadn't had things on my mind, he said. Come on, I want you in front of Calcifer. The dog braced all 4 shaggy feet. Hal lugged at it, braced and sliding. Michael! He yelled. There was a particular sound to that yell, which brought Michael running. And did you know this dog was really a man? Hal asked as he and Michael dragged the reluctant mountain of a dog up the stairs. He's not, is he? He's not, is he? Michael asked, shocked and surprised. Then I let you off and just blamed Sophie, Hal said, hauling the dog through the broom cupboard. Anything like this is always Sophie. But you knew, didn't you, Calcifer? He said as the 2 of them dragged the dog in front of the hearth. Calcifer retreated until he was bent backward against the chimney. You never asked, he said. Do I have to ask you? Hal said, all right, I should have noticed myself. But you disgust me, Calcifer. Compared with the way the witch treats her demon, you will live a revoltingly easy life. and all I ask in return is that you tell me things I need to know. This is twice you've let me down. Now help me get this creature to its own shape this minute." Calcifer was an unusually sickly shade of blue. "All right," he said sulkily. The dogman tried to get away, but Hal got his shoulder under its chest and shoved so that it went up onto its hind legs willy-nilly. Then he and Michael held it there. "What's the silly creature holding out for?" Hal panted. "This feels like one of the Witch of the Wastes again, doesn't it?" "Yes, there are several layers of it," said Calcifer. "Let's get the dog part off anyway," said Hal. Calcifer surged to a deep, roaring blue. Sophie watched prudently from the door of the broom cupboard, saw the shaggy dog shape fade away inside the man shape. It faded to dog again, then back to man, blurred, then hardened. Finally, Hal and Michael were each holding the arm of a ginger-haired man in a crumpled brown suit. Sophie was not surprised she had not recognized him. Apart from his anxious look, his face was almost totally lacking in personality. "Now, who are you, my friend?" Hal asked him. The man put his hands up and shakily felt his face. I'm not sure," Calcifer said. The most recent name he answered to was Percival. The man looked at Calcifer as if he wished Calcifer did not know this. "Did I?" he said. "Then we'll call you Percival for now," Hal said. He turned the ex-dog round and sat him in the chair. "Sit there and take it easy and tell us what you do remember. By the feel of you, the witch had you for some time." "Yes," said Percival, rubbing his face again. "She took my head off. I remember being on a shelf looking at the rest of me." "Why, seriously took his head off?" Michael was astonished. "But you'd be dead," he protested. "Not necessarily," said Hal. "You haven't got to that sort of witchcraft yet, but I could take any piece of you I wanted and leave the rest of you alive if I went about it the right way." He frowned at the ex-dog. "But I'm not sure the witch put this one back together properly." Calcifer, who was obviously trying to prove that he was working hard for Hal, said, "This man is incomplete. He has parts from some other man, too." Percival looked more distraught than ever. "Don't alarm him, Calcifer," Hal said. "He must feel bad enough anyway. Do you know why the witch took your head off, my friend?" he asked Percival. "No," said Percival. "I don't remember anything." Sophie knew that could not be true. She snorted rather. Michael was suddenly seized with the most exciting idea. He leaned over Percival and asked, Did you ever answer to the name Justin? Or Your Royal Highness?" Sophie snorted again. She knew this was ridiculous even before Percival said, "No. The witch called me Gaston, but that isn't my name." "Don't crowd him, Michael," said Howl. "And don't make Sophie snort again. The mood she's in she'll bring down the castle next time." Though that seemed to mean Hal was no longer angry, Sophie found that she was angrier than ever. She stumped off into the shop where she banged about, shutting the shop and putting things away for the night. She went to look at her daffodils. Something had gone horribly wrong with them. They were wet brown things trailing out of a bucket full of the most poisonous-smelling liquid she had ever come across. "Oh, confound it all!" Sophie yelled. "What's all this now?" said Hal, arriving in the shop. He bent over the bucket and sniffed. "You seem to have some rather efficient weed killer here. How about trying it on those weeds on the drive of the mansion?" "I will," said Sophie. "I feel like killing something." So she slammed around until she found a watering can and stumped back into the castle with the can and the bucket, where she hurled open the door, orange down, onto the mansion drive. Percival looked up anxiously. They had given him the guitar, rather as you give a baby a rattle, and he was sitting making horrible twangings. "You go with her, Percival," Hal said. "The mood she's in, she'll be killing all the trees, too." So Percival laid down the guitar and took the bucket carefully out of Sophie's hand. She stumped into a golden summer evening at the end of the valley. Everyone had been too busy up to now to pay much attention to the mansion. It was much grander than Sophie had realized. It had a weedy terrace with statues along the edge and steps down to the drive. When Sophie looked back, on the pretext of telling Percival to hurry up, she saw the house was very big, with more statues along the roof and rows of windows. But it was derelict. Green mildew ran down the peeling wall from every window. Many of the windows were broken, and the shutters that should have folded against the wall beside them were gray and blistered and hanging sideways. "Huh!" said Sophie. "I think the least Hal could do is make the place look a little more lived in. But no, he's far too busy gadding off to Wales. Don't just stand there, Percival. Pour some of that stuff into the can, and then come along behind me." Percival meekly did as she said. He was no fun at all to bully. Sophie suspected that was why Hal had sent him with her. She snorted and took her anger out on the weeds. Whatever the stuff was that had killed the daffodils, it was strong. The weeds in the drive died as soon as it touched them. So did the grass at the sides of the drive until Sophie calmed down a little. The evening calmed her. The fresh air was blowing off the distant hills, and clumps of trees planted at the sides of the drive rustled majestically into it. Sophie weed-killed her way down a quarter of the drive. "You remember a great deal more than you let on," she accused Percival while he refilled her can. "What did the witch really want with you? Why did she bring you into the shop with her that time?" "She wanted to find out about Hal," Percival said. "Hal?" said Sophie. "But you didn't know him, did you?" "No, but I must have known something. It had to do with the curse she'd put on him," Percival explained, "but I've no idea what it was. She took it, you see, after we came to the shop. I feel bad about that. I was trying to stop her knowing, because a curse is an evil thing, and I did it by thinking about Letty. Letty was just in my head. I don't know how I knew her, because Letty said she'd never seen me when I went to Upper Folding. But I knew all about her, enough so that when the witch made me tell her about Letty, I said she kept a hat shop in Market Shipping. So the witch went there to teach us both a lesson. And you were there. She thought you were Letty. I was horrified because I didn't know Letty had a sister." Sophie picked up the can and weed killed generously, wishing the weeds were the witch. "And she turned you into a dog straight after that?" "Just outside the town," said Percival. "As soon as I let her know what she wanted, she opened the carriage door and said, 'Off you run, I'll call you when I need you.' And I ran because I could feel some sort of spell following me. It caught up just as I got to a farm, and the people there saw me change into a dog and thought I was a werewolf and tried to kill me. I had to bite one to get away, but I couldn't get rid of the stick, and it stuck to the hedge when I tried to get through." Sophie weed-killed her way down another curve of the drive as she listened. "Then you went to Mrs. Fairfax's?" "Yes. I was looking for Letty. They were both very kind to me," Percival said, even though they'd never seen me before, "and Wizard Howl kept visiting to court Letty. Letty didn't want him, and she asked me to bite him to get rid of him, until Hal suddenly began asking her about you, and..." Sophie narrowly missed weed-killing her shoes. Since the gravel was smoking where the stuff met it, this was probably just as well. "What?" "He said, 'I know someone called Sophie who looks a little like you.' And Letty said, 'That's my sister,' without thinking," Percival said, "and she got terribly worried then, particularly as Hal went on asking about her sister. Letty said she could have bitten her tongue off. The day you came there, she was being nice to Hal in order to find out how he knew you. Hal said you were an old woman, and Mrs. Fairfax said she'd seen you. Letty cried and cried. She said something terrible has happened to Sophie, and the worst of it is that she'll think that she's safe from Hal. Sophie's too kind herself to see how heartless Hal is, and she was so upset that I managed to turn into a man long enough to say I'd go and keep an eye on you." Sophie spread Weed Killer in a great smoking arc. "Bother Letty. It's very kind of her, and I love her dearly for it. I've been quite as worried about her. But I do not need a watchdog." "Aw. That solves that mystery." "Yes, you do," said Percival. "Or you did. I arrived far too late." Sophie swung round, Weed Killer and all. Percival had to leap into the grass and run for his life behind the nearest tree. The grass died in a long brown swath behind him as he ran. "Curse everyone!" Sophie cried out. "I'm done with a lot of you!" She dumped the smoking watering can in the middle of the drive and marched off through the weeds toward the stone gateway. "Too late," she muttered as she marched. Too late," she muttered as she marched. "What nonsense! Hal's not only heartless, he's impossible. Besides," she added, "I am an old woman." But she could not deny that something had been wrong ever since the moving castle moved, or even before that, and it seemed to tie up with the way Sophie seemed so mysteriously unable to face either of her sisters. "And all the things I told the king are true," she went on. She was going to march 7 leagues on her own 2 feet and not come back. Show everyone who cared that poor Mrs. Penstemon had relied on Sophie to stop Hal from going to the bad. Sophie was a failure anyway. It came of being the eldest, and Mrs. Penstemon had thought Sophie was Hal's loving old mother anyway. Hadn't she? Or had she? Uneasily, Sophie realized that a lady whose trained eye could detect a charm sewn into a suit could surely even more easily detect the stronger magic of the witch's spell. "Oh, confound that grey and scarlet suit," Sophie said. "I refuse to believe that I was the one who got caught with it." The trouble was, the blue and silver suit seemed to have worked just the same. She stumped a few steps further. "Anyway," she said with great relief, "Hal doesn't like me." This reassuring thought would have been enough to keep Sophie walking all night, had not a sudden familiar uneasiness swept over her. Her ears had a distinct tock-tock-tock. Her ears had caught a distinct tock-tock-tock. She looked sharply under the low sun, and there, on the dirt on the road, which wound away behind the stone gate, was a distant figure with outstretched arms, hopping. Sophie picked up her skirts, whirled around, and sped back the way she had come. Dust and gravel flew up around her in clouds. Percival was standing forlornly in the drive beside the bucket and the watering can. Sophie seized him and dragged him behind the nearest tree. "Is something wrong?" he said. "Quiet! It's that dratted Scarecrow again," Sophie gasped. She shut her eyes. "We're not here," she said. "You can't find us. Go away. Go away fast, fast, fast." "But why?" said Percival. "Shut up! Not here, not here, not here," Sophie said desperately. She opened one eye. The Scarecrow, almost between the gateposts, was standing still, swaying uncertainly. "That's right," "That's right," said Sophie. "We're not here. Go away fast. Twice as fast. 3 times as fast. 10 times as fast. Go away!" And the Scarecrow hesitantly swayed round on its stick and began to hop back up the road. After the first few hops, it was going in giant leaps, faster and faster, just as Sophie had told it to. Sophie hardly breathed, and did not let go of Percival's sleeve until the Scarecrow was out of sight. "What's wrong with it?" said Percival. "Why didn't you want it?" Sophie shuddered. Since the Scarecrow was out on the road, she did not dare leave now. She picked up the watering can and stumped back to the mansion. A fluttering caught her eye as she went. She looked up at the building. The flutter was from long white curtains blowing from an open French window beyond the statues of the terrace. The statues were now clean white stone, and she could see curtains at most of the windows, and glass, too. The shutters were now folded properly beside them, newly painted white. Not a green stain nor a blister marked the new creamy plaster of the house front. The front door was a masterpiece of black paint and gold scrollwork, centering on a gilded lion with a ring in its mouth for a door knocker. "Huh," said Sophie. She resisted the temptation to go through the open window and explore. That was what Hal wanted her to do. She marched straight to the front door, seized the golden doorknob, and threw the door open with a crash. Hal and Michael were at the bench, hastily dismantling a spell. Part of it must have been to change the mansion, but the rest, as Sophie knew well, had to be a listening-in spell of some kind. As Sophie stormed in, both their faces shot nervously round toward her. Calcifer instantly plunged down under his logs. "Keep behind me, Michael," said Hal. "Eavesdropper!" Sophie shouted. "Snooper!" "What's wrong?" Hal said. "Do you want the shutters black and gold, too?" "You barefaced," Sophie stuttered. "That wasn't the only thing you heard. You... How long have you known I am... "Under a spell?" said Hal. "Well, now..." "I told him," Michael said, looking nervously round Hal. "My Letty..." "You!" Sophie shrieked. "The other Letty let the cat out of the bag, too," Hal said quickly. "You know she did. And Mrs. Fairfax talked a great deal that day. There was a time when everyone seemed to be telling me. Even Calcifer did when I asked him. But do you honestly think I don't know my own business well enough not to spot a strong spell like that when I see it? I had several goes at taking it off you when you weren't looking, but nothing seems to work. I took you to Mrs. Penstemon hoping she could do something, but she evidently couldn't. I came to the conclusion that you liked being in disguise." "Disguise!" Sophie yelled. Hal laughed at her. "It must be, since you're doing it yourself," he said. "What a strange family you are. Is your name really Letty, too?" This was too much for Sophie. Percival edged nervously in just then, carrying the half-full bucket of weed killer. Sophie dropped her can, seized the bucket from him, and threw it at Hal. Hal ducked. Michael dodged the bucket. The weed killer went up in a sheet of sizzling green flame from floor to ceiling. The bucket clanged into the sink, where all the remaining flowers died instantly. "Ow!" said Calcifer from under the logs. "That was strong." Hal carefully picked the skull out from under the smoking brown remains of the flowers, and dried it on one of his sleeves. "Of course it was strong," he said. "Sophie never does things by halves." The skull, as Hal wiped it, became bright, new white, and the sleeve he was using developed a faded blue and silver patch. Hal set the skull on the bench and looked at his sleeve ruefully. Sophie had half a mind to stump straight out of the castle again and away down the drive, but there was that Scarecrow. She settled for stumping to the chair instead, where she sat and fell into a deep sulk. I'm not going to speak to any of them, she thought. Let me just take some water. So everybody actually did know that Sophie was under a spell. That's interesting. And also knows that she and Letty and Martha, who they think is just another Letty right now, are all sisters. That's funny that Hal was trying to take the spell off of Sophie, like, without Sophie even realizing. And then also that, Sophie, what's it called? And that was also another reason why he took her to Mrs. Penstemon. Just, like, sitting up here like this. Just a little more comfortable right now. Don't mind me. Okay, and then... Okay. Sophie, Hal said, I did my best. Haven't you noticed that your aches and pains have been better lately? Or do you enjoy having those too? Sophie did not answer. Hal gave her up and turned to Percival. I'm glad to see that you have some brain after all, he said. You had me worried. I really don't remember very much, Percival said. But he stopped behaving like a half-wit. He picked the guitar up and tuned it. He had it sounding much nicer in seconds. My sorrow revealed, Hal said pathetically. I was born an unmusical Welshman. Did you tell Sophie all of it? Or did you really know what the witch was trying to find out? She wanted to know about Wales, said Percival. I thought that was it, Hal said soberly. Ah, well. He went away into the bathroom, where he was gone for the next 2 hours. During that time, Percival played a number of tunes on the guitar in a slow, thoughtful way, as if he was teaching himself how to, while Michael crawled about the floor with the smoking rag, trying to get rid of the weed killer. Sophie sat in the chair and said not a word. Calcifer kept bobbling up and peeping at her, and going down again under the logs. Hal came out of his bathroom with his suit glossy black, his hair glossy white, and a cloud of steam smelling of gentians. I may be back quite late, he said to Michael. It's going to be Midsummer Day after midnight, and the witch may well try something, so keep all the defenses up, and remember all I told you, please. Yeah, I know, that's interesting, right? I'm wondering if she is, like, just her feeling like an old woman. It might be what's keeping her an old woman. Stupid spaghetti strap keeps falling. And I'm wondering if that is the case. Okay. Alright, Michael said, putting the steaming remains of the rag in the sink. Hal turned to Percival. I think I know what's happened to you, he said. It is going to be I think I know... Oh, sorry. I think I know what's happened to you, he said. It's going to be a fair job sorting you out, but I'll have a go tomorrow after I get back. Hal went to the door and stopped with his hand on the knob. Sophie, are you still not talking to me? He asked miserably. Sophie knew Hal could sound unhappy in heaven if it suited him. And he had just used her to get information out of Percival. No, she snarled. Hal sighed and went out. Sophie looked up and saw that the knob was pointed black down. That does it, she thought. I don't care if it is Midsummer Day tomorrow. I'm leaving. Chapter 20, in which Sophie finds further difficulties in leaving the castle. Midsummer Day dawned. About the same moment that it did, Hal crashed in through the door with such a noise that Sophie shot up in her cubbyhole, convinced that the witch was hot on his heels. They think so much about me that they always play without me, Hal bellowed. Sophie realized that he was only trying to sing Calcifer's saucepan song and lay down again, whereupon Hal fell over the chair and caught his foot on the stool so that it shot across the room. After that, he tried to go upstairs through the Wow, I can't read. After that, he tried to go upstairs through the broom cupboard, and then the yard. This seemed to puzzle him a little, but finally he discovered the stairs, all except the bottom one, and fell upon them on his face. The whole castle shook. "What's the matter?" Sophie said, sticking her head through the banister. "Rugby club reunion," Hal replied with thick dignity. "Didn't know I used to fly up the wing from my university, did you, Mrs. Nose?" "If you were trying to fly, you must have forgotten how," Sophie said. "I was born to strange sights," said Hal, "things invisible to see, and I was just on my way to bed when you interrupted me. I know where all past years are, and who left the Devil's Foot." Go to bed, you fool," Calcifer said sleepily. "You're drunk." "Who, me?" said Hal. "I assure you, my friends, I am cone-soled Stober." He got up and stalked upstairs, feeling the wall as if he thought it might escape him unless he kept in touch with it. His bedroom door did escape him. "What a lie that was," Hal remarked as he walked into the wall. "My shining dishonesty will be the salvation of me." He walked into the wall several times more, in several different places, before he discovered his bedroom door and crashed his way through it. Sophie could hear him falling about, saying that his bed was dodging. "He is quite impossible," Sophie said, and she decided to leave at once. Exactly, Stober. Yes, cone-soled Stober. Unfortunately, the noise Hal made woke Michael up, and Percival, who was sleeping on the floor in Michael's room. "Oh, poor Percival, he's still acting like a dog." Michael came downstairs saying that they were so thoroughly awake that they might as well go out and gather the flowers for the midsummer garlands while the day was still cool. Sophie was not sorry to go out into the place of flowers for one last time. There was a warm, milky haze out there, filled with scent and half-hidden colors. Sophie thumped along, testing the squashy ground with her stick and listening to the whirrings and twitters of the thousands of birds, feeling truly regretful. She stroked a moist satin lily and fingered one of the ragged purple flowers with long, powdery stamens. She looked back at the tall castle breasting the mist behind them. She sighed. "He made it much better," Percival remarked as he put an armful of hibiscus into Michael's floating bath. "Who did?" said Michael. "Hal," said Percival. "They were only bushes at first, and they were quite small and dry." "You remember being here before?" Michael asked excitedly. He had by no means given up his idea that Percival might be Prince Justin. "I think I was here with the witch," Percival said doubtfully. They fetched 2 bathloads of flowers. Sophie noticed that when they came in the second time, Michael spun the knob over the door several times. That must have had something to do with keeping the witch out. Then, of course, there were the midsummer garlands to make. That took a long time. Sophie had meant to leave Michael and Percival to do that, but Michael was too busy asking Percival cunning questions, and Percival was very slow at the work. Sophie knew what made Michael excited. There was a sort of air about Percival, as if he expected something to happen soon. It made Sophie wonder just how much in the power of the witch he still was. She had to make most of the garlands. Any thoughts she might have had about staying and helping Hal against the witch vanished. Hal, who could have made all the garlands just by waving his hand, was now snoring so loudly she could hear him right through in the shop. They were so long making the garlands that it was time to open the shop before they had finished. Michael fetched them bread and honey, and they ate while they dealt with the tremendous first rush of customers. Although Midsummer Day in the way of holidays, had turned out to be a gray and chilly day in market shipping, half the town came, dressed in fine holiday clothes, to buy flowers and garlands for the festival. There was the usual jostling crowd out in the street. So many people came into the shop that it was getting on for midday before Sophie finally stole away up the stairs and through the broom cupboard. They had taken so much money, Sophie thought as she stole about, packing up some food and her old clothes in a bundle, that Michael's hoard under the hearthstone would be 10 times the size. "Have you come to talk to me?" said Calcifer. "In a moment," said Sophie, crossing the room with her bundle up behind her back. She did not want Calcifer raising an outcry about the contract. She stretched out her hand to unhook her stick from the chair, and somebody knocked at the door. Sophie stuck with her hand stretched out, looking inquiringly at Calcifer. "It's the mansion door," said Calcifer. "Flesh and blood and harmless." The knocking came again. This always happens when I try to leave, Sophie thought. She turned the knob orange down and opened the door. There was a carriage in the drive beyond the statues, pulled by a goodish pair of horses. Sophie could see it round the edges of the very large footman who had been doing the knocking. Oh, this name. Mrs. Sackaverell, Mrs. Sackaverell Smith, to call upon the new occupants, said the footman. How very awkward, Sophie thought. It was not the result of Howl's new paint and curtains. We're not at she began, but Mrs. Sackaverell Smith swept the footman aside and came in. Wait with the carriage, Theobald, she said to the footman as she sailed past Sophie, folding her parasol. It was Fanny. Fanny looking wonderfully prosperous in cream silk. She was wearing a cream silk hat trimmed with roses, which Sophie remembered only too well. She remembered what she'd said to that hat as she trimmed it. You were going to have to marry money. And it was quite clear from the look of her that Fanny had. Oh dear, said Fanny, looking round. There must be some mistake. This is the servants' quarters. Well, we're not really quite moved in yet, madam, Sophie said, and wondered how Fanny would feel if she knew that the old hat shop was only just beyond the bedroom cupboard. Fanny turned round and gasped at Sophie. Sophie! She exclaimed. Oh, good gracious, child, what's happened to you? You look about 90. Have you been very ill? And to Sophie's surprise, Fanny threw aside her hat and her parasol in all of her grand manner and flung her arms around Sophie and wept. Oh, I didn't know what had happened to you, she sobbed. I went to Martha and I sent to Letty and neither of them knew. They changed places, silly girls, did you know? But nobody knew a thing about you. I've a reward out still, and here you are, working as a servant when you should be living in luxury up in the hill with me and Mr. Smith. Sophie found she was crying as well. She hurriedly dropped her bundle and led Fanny to the chair. She pulled the stool up and sat beside Fanny, holding her hand. By this time, they were both laughing as well as crying. They were most powerfully glad to see one another. It's a long story, Sophie said, after Fanny had asked her 6 times what had happened to her. When I looked in the mirror and saw myself like this, it was such a shock that I sort of wandered away. Overwork, said Fanny, said wretchedly. How I blame myself. Oh, not really, said Sophie, and you mustn't worry, because Wizard Howl took me in. Wizard Howl! Exclaimed Fanny. That wicked, wicked man! Has he done this to you? Where is he? Let me at him! She seized her parasol and became so very warlike that Sophie had to hold her down. Sophie did not care to think how Howl might react if Fanny woke him by stabbing him with her parasol. No, no, she said. Howl has been very kind to me. And this was true, Sophie realized. Howl showed his kindness rather strangely, but considering all Sophie had done to annoy him, he had been very good to her indeed. Oh, yeah, she is. She is very, what's it called? Protective of her. It can't, so, well, I'm pretty sure, isn't Wizard Suleiman Ben Sullivan? So, like, he keeps insisting that he's not. Or something like that. Is that just my assumption? Have we not gotten that? It's been a while. Anyway. But they say he eats women alive, Fanny said, still struggling to get up. Sophie held down her waving parasol. He doesn't really, she said. Do listen. He's not wicked at all. There was a bit of a fizz from the grate at this, where Calcifer was watching with some interest. He isn't, Sophie said, to Calcifer as much as to Fanny, and all the time I've been here I've not seen him work a single evil spell. Which again was true, she knew. Then I have to believe you, Fanny said, relaxing, though I'm sure it must be your doing if he's reformed. You always did have a way with you, Sophie. You could stop Martha's tantrums when I couldn't do a thing with her. And I always said it was thanks to you that Letty only got her own way half of the time instead of all of the time. But you should have told me where you were, love. Sophie knew she should have. She had taken Martha's view of Fanny whole and entire when she should have known Fanny better. She was ashamed. Fanny could not wait to tell Sophie about Mr. Mr. Sacheverell Smith. She launched into a long and excited account of how she had met Mr. Smith and the very week Sophie had left, and married him before the week was out. Sophie watched her as she talked. Being old gave her an entirely new view of Fanny. She was a lady who was still young and pretty, and she had found that the hat shop was as boring, as boring as Sophie did. But she had stuck with it and done her best both with the shop and with the three girls, until Mr. Hatter died. Then she'd suddenly been afraid she was just like Sophie, old, with no reason and nothing to show for it. And then, with you not being there to pass it on to, there seemed no reason not to sell the shop, Fanny was saying, when there was a clatter of feet in the broom cupboard. Michael came through, saying, "We've shut the shop, and look who's here!" He was holding Martha's hand. Martha was thinner and fairer and almost looked like herself again. She let go of Michael and rushed at Sophie, shouting, "Sophie, you should have told me!" while she flung her arms around her. Then she flung her arms around Fanny, just as if she had never said all those things about her. But this was not all. Letty and Mrs. Fairfax came through the cupboard after Martha, carrying a hamper between them, and after them came Percival, who looked livelier than Sophie had ever seen him. "We came over by the carrier at first," Mrs. Fairfax said, "and we brought... Bless me! It's Fanny!" She dropped her end of the hamper and ran to hug Fanny. Letty dropped her end and ran to hug Sophie. In fact, there was such general hugging and exclaiming and shouting that Sophie thought it was a marvel how Howl did not wake up, but she could hear him snoring even through the shouting. I shall have to leave this evening, she thought. She was too glad to see everyone to consider going before that. Letty was very fond of Percival. While Michael carried the hamper to the bench and unpacked cold chickens and wines and honey puddings from it, Letty hung on to Percival's arm in an owner-like way that Sophie could not quite approve of, and made him tell her all that he remembered. Percival did not seem to mind. Letty looked so lovely that Sophie did not blame him. "He just arrived and kept turning into a man and then into different dogs and insisting that he knew me," Letty said to Sophie. "I knew I'd never seen him before, but it didn't matter." She patted Percival's shoulder as if he were still a dog. "But you had met Prince Justin?" she said. "Oh, yes," Letty said offhandedly. "Mind you, he was in a disguise in a green uniform, but it was obviously him. He was so smooth and courtly, even when he was annoyed about the finding spells. I had to make him up two lots because they would keep showing that Wizard Suleiman was somewhere between us and Market Chipping, and he swore that couldn't be true. And all the time I was doing them, he kept interrupting me, calling me sweet lady in a sarcastic sort of way, and asking me who I was and where my family lived and how old I was. I thought it was cheek. I'd rather have Wizard Howl, and that's saying something." By this time, everyone was milling about, eating chicken and sipping wine. Calcifer seemed to be shy. He had gone down to green flickers, and nobody seemed to notice him. Sophie wanted him to meet Letty. She tried to coax him out. "Is that really the demon who has the charge of Howl's life?" Letty said, looking down at the green flickers rather disbelievingly. Sophie looked up to assure Letty that Calcifer was real, and saw Miss Angorian standing by the door, looking shy and uncertain. "Oh, do excuse me, I've come at a bad time, haven't I?" Miss Angorian said. I just wanted to talk to Howl." Sophie stood up, not quite sure what to do. She was ashamed of the way she had driven Miss Angorian out before. It was only because she knew Howl was courting Miss Angorian. On the other hand, that did not mean she had to like her. Michael took things out of Sophie's hands by greeting Miss Angorian with a beaming smile and a shout of welcome. How's asleep at the moment," he said. "Come and have a glass of wine while you wait." "How kind," said Miss Angorian. But it was plain that Miss Angorian was not happy. She refused wine and wandered nervously about, nibbling at a leg of chicken. The room was full of people who all knew one another very well, and she was the outsider. Fanny did not help by turning from non-stop talk with Mrs. Fairfax and saying, What peculiar clothes!" Martha did not help either. She had seen how admiringly Michael greeted Miss Angorian. She went and made sure that Michael did not talk to anyone but herself and Sophie. And Letty ignored Miss Angorian and went to sit on the stairs with Percival. Miss Angorian seemed rather quickly to decide that she had had enough. Sophie saw her at the door trying to open it. She hurried over, feeling very guilty. After all, Miss Angorian must have felt very strongly about Howl to have come here at all. "Please don't go yet," Sophie said. "I'll go and wake Howl up." "Oh, no, you mustn't do that," Miss Angorian said, smiling nervously. "I've got the day off, and I'm quite happy to wait. I thought I'd go and explore outside. It's rather stuffy in here with that funny green fire burning. This seemed to Sophie the perfect way to get rid of Miss Angorian without really getting rid of her. She politely opened the door for her. Somehow, maybe it had to do with the defenses Hal had asked Michael to keep up, the knob had got turned round to purple down. Outside was a misty blaze of sun and the drifting banks of red and purple flowers. What rhododendrons. Okay. What gorgeous rhododendrons! Miss Angorian exclaimed in her huskiest and most throbbing voice. I must look. She sprang eagerly down into the marshy grass. Don't go towards the southeast, Sophie called after her. The castle was drifting off sideways. Miss Angorian buried her beautiful face in a cluster of white flowers. I won't go far at all, she said. Good gracious, Fanny said, coming up behind Sophie. Whatever has happened to my carriage? Sophie explained as far as she could. But Fanny was so worried that Sophie had to turn the door orange down and open it to show the mansion drive in a much grayer day, where the footman and Fanny's coachman were sitting on the roof of the carriage eating cold sausage and playing cards. Only then would Fanny believe that her carriage had not been mysteriously spirited away. Sophie was trying to explain, without really knowing herself, how one door could open on several different places when Calcifer surged up from his logs, roaring, How? He roared, filling the chimney with blue flame. How? Howell Jenkins, the witch has found your sister's family! There were two violent thumps overhead. Hal's bedroom door crashed, and Hal came tearing downstairs. Letty and Percival were hurled out of his way. Fanny screamed faintly at the sight of him. Hal's hair was like a haystack, and there were red rims around his eyes. Got me on my weak flank, blast her! He shouted as he shot across the room with his black sleeves flying. I was afraid she would. Thanks, Calcifer. He shoved Fanny aside and hurled open the door. Oh, yeah. What's it called? Sorry, I didn't see your comment. But, yeah, I guess it is a flower. I haven't seen, what it looks like, but, yeah. Sophie heard the door bang behind Hal as... Hold on. As she hobbled upstairs. She knew it was nosy, but she had to see what happened. As she hobbled through Hal's bedroom, she heard everyone else following her. What a filthy room, Fanny exclaimed. Sophie looked out the window. It was drizzling in the neat garden. The swing was hung with drops. The witch's waving mane of red hair was all dewed with it. She stood leaning against the swing, tall and commanding in her red robes, beckoning and beckoning again. Hal's niece, Mari, was shuffling over the wet grass toward the witch. She did not look as if she wanted to go, but she seemed to have no choice. Behind her, Hal's nephew, Neil, was shuffling toward the witch even more slowly, glowering in his most ferocious way. And Hal's sister, Megan, was behind the two children. Sophie could see Megan's arms gesturing and Megan's mouth opening and shutting. She was clearly giving the witch a piece of her mind, but she was being drawn toward the witch, too. Hal burst out onto the lawn. He had not bothered to alter his clothes. He did not bother to do any magic. He just charged straight at the witch. The witch made a grab for Mari, but Mari was still too far away. Hal got to Mari first, slunk her behind him, and charged on. And the witch ran. She ran like a cat with a dog after it, across the lawn and over the neat fence, in a flurry of flame-colored robes, with Hal, like the chasing dog, a foot or so behind and closing. The witch vanished over the fence in a red blur. Hal went after her in a black blur with trailing sleeves. Then the fence hid both of them from sight. I hope he catches her, said Martha. The little girl's crying. Down below, Megan put her arm around Mari and took both children indoors. There was no knowing what had happened to Hal and the witch. Letty and Percival and Martha and Michael went back downstairs. Fanny and Mrs. Fairfax were transfixed with disgust at the state of Hal's bedroom. Look at those spiders, Mrs. Fairfax said. And the dust on those curtains, said Fanny. Annabelle, I saw some brooms in that passage you came through. Let's get them, said Mrs. Fairfax. I'll pin that dress up for you, Fanny, and we'll get to work. I can't bear a room to be in this state. Oh, poor Hal, Sophie thought. He does love those spiders. She hovered on the stairs, wondering how to stop Mrs. Fairfax and Fanny. This is all so, bizarre, but fun. From downstairs, Michael called, Sophie, we're going to look around the mansion. Want to come? That seemed the ideal thing to stop the two ladies from cleaning. Sophie called to Fanny and hobbled hurriedly downstairs. Letty and Percival were already opening the door. Letty had not listened when Sophie explained it to Fanny, and it was clear that Percival did not understand either. Sophie saw they were opening it purple down by mistake. They got it open as Sophie hobbled across the room to put them right. The Scarecrow loomed up in the doorway against the flowers. "Shut it!" Sophie screamed. She saw what had happened. She had actually helped the Scarecrow last night by telling it to go 10 times faster. It had simply sped to the castle entrance and tried to get in there. But Miss Angorian was out there. Sophie wondered if she was lying in the bushes in a dead faint. "No, don't," she said weakly. No one was attending to her anyway. Letty's face was the color of Fanny's dress, and she was clutching Martha. Percival was standing staring, and Michael was trying to catch the skull, which was yattering its teeth so hard that it was threatening to fall off the bench and take a wine bottle with it. And the skull seemed to have a strange effect on the guitar, too. It was giving out long, humming twangs. Nom, harum, nom, harum. Calcifer flamed up the chimney again. "The thing is speaking," he said to Sophie. "It is saying that it means no harm. I think it is speaking the truth. It is waiting for your permission to come in." Certainly the Scarecrow was just standing there. It was not trying to barge inside as it had done before, and Calcifer must have trusted it. He had stopped the castle moving. Sophie looked at the turnip face and the fluttering rags. It was not so frightening after all. She'd once had fellow feeling for it. She rather suspected that she had just made it into a convenient excuse for not leaving the castle because she really wanted to stay. Now there was no point. Sophie had to leave anyway. Hal preferred Miss Angorian. "Please come in," she said a little croakily. Said the guitar. The Scarecrow surged into the room with one powerful sideways hop. It stood swinging on its one leg as if it was looking for something. The smell of flowers it had brought in with it did not hide its own smell of dust and rotting turnip. The skull yattered under Michael's fingers again. The Scarecrow spun round gladly and fell sideways toward it. Michael made one attempt to rescue the skull and then got hastily out of the way, for as the Scarecrow fell across the bench, there came the fizzing jolt of strong magic, and the skull melted into the Scarecrow's turnip head. It seemed to get inside the turnip and fill it out. There was now a strong suggestion of a rather craggy face on the turnip. The trouble was, it was on the back of the Scarecrow. It was on the back of the Scarecrow. The Scarecrow gave a wooden scramble, hopping upright uncertainly, and then swiftly spun its body round so that the front of it was under the craggy turnip face. Slowly, it eased its outstretched arms down to its sides. "Now I can speak," it said in a somewhat mushy voice. "I may faint," Fanny announced on the stairs. "Nonsense," Mrs. Fairfax said behind Fanny. "The thing's only a magician's golem. It has to do what it was sent to do. They're quite harmless." Letty, all the same, looked ready to faint. But the only one who did faint was Percival. He flopped to the floor quite quietly and lay curled up as if he were asleep. Letty, in spite of her terror, ran toward him, only to back away as the Scarecrow gave another hop and stood itself in front of Percival. "This is one of the parts I was sent to find," it said in its mushy voice. It swung on its stick until it was facing Sophie. "I must thank you," it said. "My skull was far away, and I ran out of strength before I reached it. I would have lain in that hedge forever if you had not come and talked life into me." It swiveled to Mrs. Fairfax and then to Letty. "I thank you both, too," it said. "Who sent you? What are you supposed to do?" Sophie said. The Scarecrow swung about uncertainly. "More than this," it said. "There are still parts missing." Everyone waited, most of them too shaken to speak, while the Scarecrow rotated this way and that, seemingly thinking. "What is Percival a part of?" Sophie said. "What is Percival a part of?" Sophie said. "Let it collect itself," said Calcifer. "No one's asked it to explain itself before." He suddenly stopped speaking and shrank until barely a green flame showed. Michael and Sophie exchanged alarmed glances. Then a new voice spoke, out of nowhere. It was enlarged and muffled, as if it were speaking in a box. But it was unmistakably the voice of the witch. "Michael Fisher," it said, "tell your master Howl that he fell for my decoy. I now have the woman called Lily Angorian in my fortress in the waste. Tell him I will only let her go if he comes himself to fetch her. Is that clear, Michael Fisher?" The Scarecrow whirled round and hopped for the open door. Oh no, Michael cried. Stop it! The witch must have sent it so that she could get in, here. Okay, and that's how we're supposed to end for today. As exciting as it is, and look how little we have left. It's just this little bit. I'm really excited to finish this up. I'd like to keep going, but my voice. So, let's discuss instead. What do you guys have to say about what we read? Pardon me for my unattractive sniffling. It's a little, what's it called? Like, cloudy here and stuff, so my head's bothering me, and I'm also, like, nasally. Oh, I'm glad you're enjoying it. Me too. I'm also really enjoying it. I'm sad that the story's almost over. You know, I found out, I think that this is actually part of a series. I think this is just the first book in the series, now that I think about it. Not that we're supposed to be reading the next books next. The next book we actually have, which I'll tell you about now, because if you guys want to read, you might as well get a copy of it now, since we'll definitely be finishing Howl's Moving Castle next time. Will be the Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. I'll go ahead and write it in the chat so you've got that. So what do you have that you're confused about? Is there anything I can help with? Yeah, I would like to read more in the series. I really like the characters, and I really like the story, and just how the story has been, like, told. My favorite things about this story, honestly, is that, like, reveals just kind of, like, happen, like, the way they would. It's not, like, there's not, like, a big, production around the reveals. It's like you have to actually be listening to catch them. And also, like, but, well, I mean, I don't know what's confusing you, I guess. So, like, what's happened now is, Sophie's family seemed to already know when they saw her that something was going on, that she was Sophie. Like, so Letty knew. And then Michael was basically able to tell Martha about Sophie, and she realized that it was her sister Sophie. So even though she sees that she's old, she still recognizes her as Sophie. And Fanny, too, recognized her right away. And so they're all reunited now. The Witch of the Waste, who has it out for Howl's life, showed up to try and hurt his family back in Wales, in our world, our reality. And he had to go and fight her off, and he did. But now he's taken Miss Angorian, who seems to actually have a crush on Howl, as what's it called? As her prisoner and hostage. Although, actually, I think that Miss Angorian might be the spy for the witch. I actually don't think it's the Scarecrow. Everyone seems to think that it's the Scarecrow, that the Scarecrow, who finally was allowed into the house, and now has the ability to speak, is the one who what's it called? Who was the witch's spy. But I think it was Miss Angorian, because she was just trying to, like, look at too many things the last time she was in. It's just kind of strange. Like, even Sophie, when Sophie was nosy, but I don't know, there's a different way about how she was going about it. And then she was like, oh, I'm gonna stay, I just wanted to, like, go out and look at the flowers, or not even look at the flowers, just go out of the castle, and the door just happened to be purple down, and she went out right outside the waist. I don't trust it. Maybe. We don't know yet. We got so little from the Scarecrow so far. But it seems like, you know, we know Percival is parts of other people too, so that's interesting. Oh, it's okay. It is hard to keep up with this book, I think, if you're not physically reading it. You really have to be on top of things, because it's so easy to miss things. I hope my explaining helped a little bit, though. And of course, if you have any other questions, you can always ask. And yeah, so ultimately I would like to try to read other books in this series, because I really enjoyed what we have read. But next we'll have the Graveyard book, and I believe the one that, like, is the next down in the poll in terms of votes was The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. Yes, his name is Percival. What are you confused about with the Dogman? Yes, he did. His name is Percival. He's the one that Letty's been sitting with and seems to like and stuff. He was a dog. He could, like, turn back into a human if he tried really hard, but then would end up turning back into, like, some other type of dog. But Hal and Michael were able to get Calcifer to break the spell that was on him, that was put on him by the Witch of the Waste. But he doesn't remember too much about himself and, like, what he's been through. He remembered that he was being made to help the witch. And he doesn't think that he's, like, he doesn't think he's Wizard Suleiman or Prince Justin, but he, there was something about, I can't remember exactly what he did remember. Yeah, that's what I was saying. He was a prisoner of the Witch of the Waste. And then after she used him for whatever he was good for, he just, like, instinctively knew Letty's name and knew where Letty was. He didn't know how he knew all that information, but knew that she worked in a hat shop. And so, instead of finding Letty, ultimately he found Sophie, or he and the witch found Sophie. And the witch turned Sophie into an old woman, I think thinking that she was Letty. Like, she was searching for Letty. So, when the witch turned him into a dog, ultimately he did find the real Letty, and there was a point where he was able to turn back into a human, at least briefly, and mentioned that he would make sure that Sophie was safe, because, like, they were bothered by Howl, and then they saw that Sophie was there the day that she was spying on Howl with Letty. And basically Letty was super sad. It was super sad. She was really sad about, like, what could possibly be happening to her sister, and her sister okay, and blah, 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 blah. So the dog man, or Percival, used his strength to turn back just to promise her that he would keep an eye on Sophie and try to keep her safe. So he raced off towards Howl's castle. And this is where he stayed, and that's why he doesn't like Howl and why he does like Sophie. So, yeah. And, I really like the evolution of the characters, too. I like how even we, as readers, we didn't know how we would feel about Fanny. Like, at first she seemed really nice, and then it was like, nah, screw Fanny. She was taking advantage of Sophie. Excuse me, and that was what, Letty and Martha believed of her. Well, maybe. But, what's it called? Yeah, so that was what Martha and Letty believed of her, so we ended up believing what they were saying. But it turned out everyone was actually wrong about Fanny, and Fanny actually was a good person. It's interesting because in the Miyazaki movie, the dog is a completely different character. I can't remember. There is a dog man, I think, or there's a dog who I think it turns into a man. I can't remember. There is that, but I don't think it's the same as what we're seeing in the book. Anyway, I'm having a lot of fun with reading, and I'm super excited to see where we end up going with this. I hope we're not ending too early if we end, but I don't know if anybody else has anything else to say, or anything else they want to talk about. Oh, me too. Thank you. I was hoping that I was differentiating them okay. I know that I think Michael and Percival sound a bit similar. Thank you. I like my hair too. I'm glad. I can't help but wonder if maybe that's part of why it's confusing, that my voices aren't really too distinct. I didn't mean to call back, and I forgot you said that it didn't have anything to do with how I'm reading it. But I also thought that could not be talking about the characters' voices, but just mean, I don't know. Well, thank you. I'm glad that the voices are distinct for you guys, and that you're, that I'm able to do that. It's interesting that now Sophie has subtly, I don't know if she's realized she likes Howl, But she's talking about how he's picked Miss Angorian over him. And that she was charmed by how, like, whether he was wearing the gray and scarlet suit or the silver and blue suit. It is very quick paced. It's, like I said, there's also, like, a lot of details where it's just, like, if you blink, you miss it. I think she does. I think he's, like, fond of her, too. I don't know that he, like, likes her, but it seems like he might be interested in her. Because he was asking Letty about her, rather. And there was, like, that moment of, what? Yeah, and he doesn't want her to be sad and stuff, and I mean, he could just be a decent person, but yeah. Well, we'll see what happens next time, because we'll be finishing the book next time. That's really exciting. We'll see what we do next time. We'll either finish the book next time and have discussion and then start the graveyard book, or we'll just finish the book, have our discussion, and end for next time. Whatever ends up feeling right is what we'll do. Yeah, I mean, it seems to be implied that she's keeping the spell up on herself. So... oh, maybe. Maybe. We'll have to see. I'm really excited to reach the conclusion. But yeah, anyway, so there we are. I'm glad we're back and able to continue. I think that there's been a lull in uploads on YouTube. I can't remember if the last episode is up there or not, but I'll try to check up on that and get back to it all and get everything organized. But of course you can watch past episodes over there on YouTube with the same username as Here Sky Destiny. And then we will be back at least next Sunday. I'm not sure what's happening for next Saturday. I'd like to get something going, either Pokemon or something. But if not next Saturday at 5 p.m., we'll at least be meeting next Sunday at 5 p.m. for Quoth the Author again. Go ahead and get your copies if you want of The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. He's a great writer. He is currently generating some buzz as he is the writer of the book series. Is it book series comics? I can't remember. I think it's comics. Sandman. The series is really blowing up right now. But he has numerous works that have been adapted to movies and such, and like all sorts of genres that he writes in. And I've always really liked him as an author. So I'll be doing that either next time or the next time. But go ahead and get yourself ready for that. And yeah, in the meantime, I will see you guys again. Go ahead, like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. And yeah, of course, don't forget to hit the bell. But I will see you guys again there. So this has been Sky. Bye-bye!